talk with you about the spotted lanternfly, management and biology of this insect. Okay, so what is a spotted lanternfly? First of all, it's a plant hopper insect. Its specific epithet is Lycorma delicatula. It's native to Asia. It was first found in southeastern Pennsylvania in 2014. Previous to that, it was also known to be invasive in Korea and in Japan. This insect belongs to the order Hemiptera, which means it has a lot of plant pest buddies in that order, and they have a very unique behavior where they use piercing, sucking mouthparts to probe plants and cause damage. And this insect belongs to the family Fulgoridae, and they are quite fancy. They have a lot of very colorful wing patterns and colors. They also have very fancy headgear. This very large extended fronds is very common among the Fulgorids. Spotted lanternfly, however, does not have an extensive fronds. It's very simple compared to many members in that family, but it does have quite fancy wings, very colorful patterned wings, especially the hind wings, which I'll show you in a bit. And something that's interesting about this insect is it's the only known pest on plants within this family. So some aspects of its biology make it a particularly good invasive pest, good for it, bad for us, right? It's really hard to manage because Fulgorids have some really quirky behaviors. So let's look at the current distribution. So since it was first found in Pennsylvania, Berks County is here in 2014. It's spread pretty extensively. We've got quarantine zones set up, and we're monitoring very closely where the insect is found. So all the blue counties are known infested zones. And the purple dots represent known individuals being found, but no official infestation. So North Carolina's on the list here with no quarantine counties, but a bunch of different locations have been identified where it's been found. So it's not just exclusive to the Northeast anymore, it's moving into the South. And we even have 2 counties in Ohio and 1 in Indiana where there are known infestations, known populations. So let's talk about the life stages. So let's start with the egg masses. So panel A here shows a single egg mass on a tree. The females can lay multiple egg masses, and they cover the egg masses with a frothy secretion. I'll talk more about that in a bit. Fulgorids tend to have only 4 nymphal life stages. Many Hemiptera have 5. The first 3, so first through 3rd instars, are black and white and just get bigger each time they molt. Their 4th and final instar, they are then quite red and very, very noticeable in the environment. Adults at rest look like this. They hold their wings kind of tent-like over their abdomen, and you can only see their forewings, but they have a very distinctive startle response, or when they're about to fly, they'll move their forewings forward and show you their hind wings, and that's where you can see the bright red coloration. So again, a closer look here at the 1st through 3rd instars. What I'd like to point out, other than their black and white spottiness and their very, I think, cute little snoot here, is they have really impressive legs, which they use to jump, but also to run. They can disperse into their environment really, really well. So here's an example of a whole bunch of egg masses laid on, this is just a post at the end of a row in a grapevine, or of grapevines in a vineyard. And each individual section here, these are individual egg masses, and these are a bunch of first instars that have hatched out, and they're just hanging out for a bit. They'll hang out for an hour, maybe a little longer, and then they'll just start moving into the environment and disperse. You'll see them in large collections, oftentimes. And when I say they can move, this is what I mean. They're really, really mobile. They can jump also, but they can just walk, run, until they find something they like to feed on. So if they hatch out somewhere not near one of their preferred hosts, they just keep on walking / running until they find something that they want to feed on. Okay, so let's talk about the timeline for newly hatched insects. So what we've got here is a trunk on this maple, and you can see there's a bunch of egg masses laid there. Like right here, these are individual holes where the nymphs have hatched out, and they're just hanging out for a bit. So an hour or so, they'll hang out near the egg masses, let their cuticle harden, and then they'll start to disperse. If they're on a host that they like, they're likely to move up. They really like to hang out in the tops of the trees as young nymphs because that's where the tender, soft leaf tissue is, and that's what they prefer to feed on. But if they hatch out on a non-host tree or a non-preferred tree, they might disperse throughout the environment. And so it's not predictable when they're going to be on the move. It really depends on what they hatch out on and how close it is in proximity to other plants that they prefer to be on. Here's an example of a fourth instar. You can see they become very red, very distinctive and noticeable in the environment. I don't have a video to show you, but if you thought the younger nymphs were really, really mobile, these guys, oof, it's impressive. They can jump really well, and they can walk/run really well. So they're very, very mobile at this stage. They don't need wings to be able to disperse through their environment. In the late summer, when you start to have adults come on, you'll see mixed groupings like this. And so the fourth instars are pretty large, but not nearly as large as the adults. The adults also look larger because their wings extend past their abdomen, so it makes them look even heftier than they are. And again, adults at rest hold their wings tent-like over their abdomens. You'll see large groups of adults. I won't say this is a large group. There can be hundreds or possibly thousands on a single tree, depending on the situation. It's convenient for me as a researcher working with these insects that they're easy to sex. Not only their large size, because you don't need a microscope to do it, but also they're very distinctive. So the female genitalia are larger and more pronounced, and they're going to have red on them. The males never have any red on their genitals. And that's a useful trait because just a regular resident, if they find a spotted lanternfly and they want to report it with an image like this and without the need of a microscope to see what they're looking at, they can tell if they've got a male or a female. And if it's a single individual in a new area that's not known to be infested, that can be a critical detail because a female might lay eggs somewhere that you don't know about, but a male is, in theory, less of a risk. So let's talk about egg masses. So egg masses are laid on, and I cannot emphasize this enough, any surface. Vines, trunks, posts, stones, lawn furniture, whatever you got. They're laid in the fall, they overwinter as eggs, and they hatch out in the spring. 35 to 40 eggs per mass is pretty typical. And you can see this female here in this video is covering her egg mass with a frothy secretion. And they do this to protect the eggs from pathogens. Predators have to saw through this covering. It's going to harden quite well, if they want to eat the eggs, but also this is important for allowing them to survive winter. They survive Pennsylvania winters just fine. We have, real winter here. So this allows them to move into even quite cold areas and survive quite well there. I mentioned they'll lay eggs on anything, right? I wasn't kidding. I mean, a light bulb? Really? A spare tire? Some lawn furniture? Here we have someone haphazardly laying this camping chair against a tree, and the insects laid not one, but like 10 egg masses on it. And this is a real concern. It's something we have to be very careful about because people can accidentally move this insect around, not just the mobile stages, but the immobile nymphal or egg stages can be moved around accidentally very easily. So we have to be really, really careful with this aspect. Okay, so let's get into some more that's my focus, my research. So let's talk about what plants can be hosts for spotted lanternfly and which hosts do they damage. So let's talk about what's on the menu. So partly, spotted lanternfly is such an effective invasive species because it has a large host range. About 70 plants that are in the published record, but there's likely many more that we don't know of yet. And host selection is going to be dependent on a bunch of different factors. So host plant preference, we've got the ever-growing list that can be found of hosts that they're known to feed on. Another factor is location and spatial distribution. So where are they? What else is in the landscape? They'll make choices depending on that situation. If they're in a lush landscape with lots of plants they like to feed on, they'll pick their favorite. But if they end up in a place where they don't have their favorites, they can still survive on a lot of plants that are in the landscape. Seasonality and seasonal development are also really important here. What time of year is it? What life stage are they? Because they have different preferences at different times of year. However, they do have a few favorite hosts. So what's on the menu for nymphs? They really like rose, grapevine, both wild and cultivated. Tree of heaven is a favorite. Black walnut, especially as nymphs, and styrax. Adults, there's some overlap. Grapevine, wild and cultivated. Tree of heaven. They really like red maple and red maple hybrids. Black walnut, but not as much as nymphs. Styrax, river birch, willow, and sumac. It's also important to know what isn't on the menu. And this list is not as extensive as we'd like. We'd like for it to be larger. But generally speaking, conifers are not fed on by these insects. They don't spend a lot of time on them. Pears, black cherry, but that doesn't mean they're exempt from having to deal with spotted lanternfly, because they'll still lay eggs on all of these trees. Especially black cherry, they really like to lay eggs in the deep divots of the bark. And so if there's black cherry right next to a stand of tree of heaven, they'll feed on the tree of heaven and then lay their eggs on the black cherry. So, okay, so now we're pivoting into some of my research. So this summer and the summer previous, I did some survivorship studies on the insect on a lot of different crops, and then I also assessed damage they did to these crops. So in 2020, we looked at fourth instars. 2021, we looked at adults. And again, these are forced feeding assays. So we caged insects to plants. We always had controls, and we counted insects every 2 to 4 days. We were also really interested in density, so we replaced dead insects to maintain density levels. We did this for raspberry and for peach. We also were interested in variable density. So for these studies, we looked at control plants with 0 insects, a low density, which was 25, a medium density, which was 50, and a high density, which was 100. Did this for cucumber, hops, grapevine, and that's 3 different varieties of 2 different species, and tree of heaven. And tree of heaven, that was really more of a positive control, because we know they do really, really well. And tree of heaven, they also damage it. Today, we're specifically going to look at peach, hops, and grapevine in more detail. So survival on peach. We added 50 insects per plant. And here we were looking at branch impacts, because something we notice in tree of heaven that we see around, but also some tree crops, is there will be branch effects. If they happen to heavily infest one branch, that branch will experience dieback. And so we wanted to compare a branch with 50 insects added and a branch that we caged but didn't put any insects on. Here we counted them every 2 to 4 days, and we assessed their survivorship. In 2020 with fourth instars, it's 41%. 2021 with adults, it was 57%. But the damage was pretty serious. So we assessed fruit drop and fruit development. So there was a 15% fruit abortion rate on the trees that were exposed versus 0% abortion rate in unexposed treatments. And for this top part, for the fruit development, we actually had whole trees that did not have spotted lanternfly on them. And for the branch and foliar impacts, we had the 2 branches being compared on the same tree, just for clarification. And the fruit on these trees that did mature was 8% smaller on average on the exposed trees. For the branch and foliar impacts, we measured branch length and we found that it was unaffected by exposure to adult insects. Leaves, however, were quite affected. So leaves on exposed branches yellowed and dropped at a much higher rate compared to unexposed branches. In fact, they had 67% fewer leaves overall, and some of the branches dropped all of their leaves. And we're tracking these trees after the end of the study, which ended in September. So we checked on them 1 month and 2 months afterwards, and they hadn't pushed new leaves. And we'll check on them again in the spring to see if the branch is dead, or if the whole tree is dead, or if they've been able to recover. So looking at hops, this is a variable density study where we had 0, 25, 50, or 100 insects added. In 2020, this was done with 4 thin stars. They did really well on hops, 81% survival. The adults did less well, 54% survival in 2021. But the adults damaged the plants much more severely than the nymphs did, which was really interesting. So on the left here, we have control hops. You can see nice full green cones. The leaves are all green. The vines here are all green. There's no necrosis. But this poor plant had 100 insects caged to it. You still see some of the dead insects are there too. And the cones are brown and shriveled, lots of dead leaves, lots of brown necrotic vines. So this plant did not recover. It looked really terrible at the end of the year. And so we might be adding hops to the list of plants that can be killed by spotted lanternfly. There's more research that needs to be done in this area, and I plan to pursue that. And these are Cascade variety hops. So let's talk about survival on grapevine. Again, I looked at 3 different varieties of 2 different species, Chardonnay, Riesling, and Concord. And this is a variable density study, 0, 25, 50, or 100 insects added. We looked at 2 varieties of Vitis vinifera, Chardonnay and Riesling, and then Concord, which is Vitis labrusca. On Chardonnay and Riesling, they didn't survive all that well, 39%, 46%. They did survive better on Concord, but all of the high density plants, treatment plants for all of these varieties were just dead sticks at the end of the trial. They defoliated them and they did not recover. At least at the end of the fall, they hadn't recovered. So the vines exposed to the highest density of spotted lanternfly were completely defoliated and exhibited vine necrosis. So here's a view through the bag with the insects still caged on it, and all of the leaves had dropped and the vine had browned, compared to a control shoot, which looks perfectly fine. So 2 months after the end of the trial, the vines showed no signs of recovery, but those vines are still in the ground in Berks County, and I'll be checking on them in the spring, and we'll do further assessments on whether they're able to recover or whether we'll call those plants officially dead. So a quick summary on what we learned from our survivorship and damage studies. We found in general that adults survived at lower rates compared to 4 thin star nymphs. We found that adults were more damaging than 4 thin star nymphs, and that seems to line up with what other researchers are finding. And this is an important point. Even if it wasn't one of their favorite plants, and even if they didn't survive well or for a long time, they survived for at least a few days on all tested hosts. That just speaks to their adaptability and their ability to use so many different hosts to survive if they need to. Most host plants can recover from a low-level infestation. That's also important to know. But high densities of this insect can be very damaging and can kill some hosts. So I came up with this little table to kind of help categorize the damage and risk assessment. So we didn't talk in detail about raspberry. We looked at raspberry because there were field reports of populations. There was a reduction in shoot growth, but it still produced berries well. So I assigned it a medium to low risk. Peach, we had that fruit drop in defoliation. I gave it a medium high risk. Cucumber, they survived really well on cucumber, and there was a minor yield reduction. So I gave it a medium high risk. Hops, There especially are reports of nymphs on hops plants out in their groves. And with fourth instars, we found minor yield reduction, but with adults, we had defoliation, vine necrosis, and possible vine death. So I gave it a high risk. Grapevine, and it seems to be all tested varieties and species so far. There is defoliation and vine necrosis and potential vine death, so I gave it a high risk. Tree of Heaven, that was really our positive control because we know it's one of their favorite plants, but even on that, we know that they can kill it. We saw significant defoliation and the death of the small trees we used, so high risk, even though that's not really a crop. Okay, so that's some of what they feed on and the damage they can cause. But specifically, how does spotted lanternfly cause feeding damage? And this is really the area of my research that I'll be expanding on in coming years. And there's a lot of work that we have to do to understand the how behind the scenes of what they're doing. But it is not easy to study hemipteran feeding behavior. They're very private about it. So remember, they have these piercing, sucking mouth parts. So you can't see what they're doing. It just looks like they're sitting there, but they could be feeding, they could be salivating, they could be ingesting. You don't know because we can't directly observe their stylets while the insect probes these opaque plant tissues. So we have to use very complicated electrophysiology, we call it EPG, to record the fluctuating voltage over time that's produced during probing. And this is technology that has to be used in a lab in potted plants because we have to apply an electrode to the soil, millivolts, not anything dangerous. But EPG opens a window into insect physiology and behavior, and we can equate that with stylent movement, salivation, ingestion. And it generates a waveform, voltage by time. Using these waveforms, we can quantify things like probing durations, frequencies, and sequences of behaviors that are important for successfully probing a plant. And we can equate these data with stylent location, plant tissue types, and many other things. So here we have an adult lanternfly on a cucumber leaf. She's got a little silver bit of glue there. It's on the outside of her body, just attached to the surface of her pronotum. And this is a gold wire going to an electrode. The plant she's feeding on has a very small applied voltage. Again, I said 50 millivolts, and that's safe, and it doesn't affect their behavior. And we can create recognizable, repeatable patterns that are waveforms representing their feeding behaviors. We can use this to create kind of a map of what they're doing inside the plant. But there's another component that's important for hemipteran feeding, and that is their saliva. They inject saliva into their hosts during probing. They use two different types of saliva. The hardening saliva, which is made of a lot of proteins, but also some carbohydrates. This is a stain that binds to proteins. So the red here is all proteins. And they basically create this straw-like structure called the salivary sheath, and it surrounds their stylets as they navigate through host tissues. They also secrete salivary enzymes. These diffuse into the tissues and they're harder to find. We can't see them using traditional staining methods. But these enzymes play a really important role in the probing process because they function to dissolve plant cell walls. They're also important for the insect being able to detoxify secondary phytochemistry. They can also initiate a strong host plant response, and they can be responsible for serious plant damage. They have physiological impacts, but also anatomical impacts for the plants. Okay, so remember, they probe plant tissues using their piercing, sucking mouth parts. We can see the labium here external to their body, but enclosed within that labium is a bundle of 4 different stylets, and it's the stylets that they actually puncture into the post-plant tissues. The labium sits on the surface. It has a bunch of sensory organs on the surface of it that they use to determine if they want to probe a plant. And hemipteran insects have a liquid diet. So they're taking up plant cell contents, including plant sap like phloem and xylem. And so they excrete what we call honeydew, and it's just a very liquid, sometimes sugary excretory product. And this is how they get rid of their excess sugar, amino acids, and water from their liquid ingested diet. And they can damage plants in two ways that are obvious. We need to learn a lot more about this, but by ingesting the phloem resource from the plant, so it takes it away from the plant, but also by injecting these salivary enzymes into host plant tissues. And in very broad terms, we can think of spotted lanternfly as a plant stressor. And stressors can include things like plant diseases, weather, nutrient imbalances, and then also insect feeding. To date, spotted lanternfly has not been observed to kill most plants. We know it kills tree of heaven. We know it kills some small saplings, and we might see some consequences of this now that there have been multiple years of infestations. It might be a cumulative effect. We also know that they can kill grapevines, and that list is going to grow as we continue to conduct these types of studies. But importantly, spotted lanternfly feeding may increase plant sensitivity to other stressors. So if a plant has experienced spotted lanternfly feeding and then it gets a disease, or there's a really harsh winter, it just may not be able to survive. It might cause reduced growth, dieback, or even death. So here's an example. This is a tree of heaven, and this branch is heavily infested with nymphs, and others aren't. And you can see that this branch in particular is showing signs of stress. So what we'll see is the leaves will yellow and just drop off the tree, and then this whole branch is likely to eventually die. It may not kill the whole tree, but it's pretty serious impacts. There are also indirect ways that the spotted lanternfly can damage hosts as a result from its feeding. And this is in the form of honeydew and sooty mold. So they have a complicated gut. They have their own microbiome and endosymbionts that help to keep them alive. So this is their giant fat belly full of fat body and eggs. And this is a bacterium where they have their endosymbionts. They have a complicated midgut filter system that filters plant sap and allows them to keep the nutrients they need. They need a lot of nitrogen, but discard what they have too much of, and that's going to be sugar and water. And so the excretory product is liquid, and we call it honeydew, but it has a lot of sugar. So here's one insect doing its thing, right? So if one insect is on this tree, it can create a whole area of stickiness below it with sugar. And imagine that same situation when you've got hundreds or thousands of insects. They can coat the sides of the tree, the leaves on this tree, but also the underbrush with honeydew. And you see this a lot. So with many insects feeding, the honeydew is going to build up on and around the plants. It attracts a lot of critters, which is sometimes very cool. Seems like my video might have frozen there, but these carpenter bees get pretty excited about it. You also see a lot of ants, honeybees, and other insects as well will come and harvest. Okay, technical difficulties here.
Okay, you are back.
We're back. I got a lot of videos in here, so that's my bad. Okay, I'll skip that video this time. We'll go to the next slide.
Okay, you should just be able to share your screen. Let me make sure I've got this all set here. Yeah. All right, folks, I'm just going to try to see if I can get Holly to unmute her mic. I've given her permission.
Okay, I'm back. And I'm just going to skip over that video. I think it was just too much.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Okay, let's talk about some mold. How exciting. So why does honeydew matter? It matters because it's an excellent medium to grow mold. So particularly sooty mold will colonize and grow on any surface. Yeah.
Holly, I'm not seeing your screen.
Really?
I'm just, yeah. Could you check and make sure that you're sharing your screen that has your presentation on it? Because right now we're just seeing your name.
Okay.
You should have a permission to do that. So there you go.
Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so yes, let's talk about mold. So honeydew is important because it's a medium to grow mold, and sooty mold will colonize anywhere that the honeydew has been deposited. So you can see this is an ailanthus tree. The leaves are coated in honeydew. The trunk is coated in honeydew, but it's not excluded to the tree that they're actually feeding on. It will affect the surrounding underbrush as well. And sites like this are really common when there's one tree or several trees that have been heavily infested by the insects. You'll see this even if the insects are long gone, like they were there last year, but they're not there now, until they were there at one point, because you can see all of this sooty mold. And when it's on these leaves, it's going to block photosynthesis. It can cause dieback of leaves that are covered in mold. And so they can have broader ranging impacts on the local environment, more than just the trees they're actually feeding on. So we can talk about what is being done to control spotted lanternfly, and it's a lot, and it's a coordinated effort. So again, coordination between multiple departments is really important. So the USDA and the Pennsylvania Department of Ag have partnered to control this insect. We've got the quarantine zone, and you've got this buffer area around it where they're constantly looking for insects moving into that area. We're also checking out areas around freeways, and this is around a rail line where there was an infestation where they must have hopped on a train and taken a ride to Altoona. So that's apparently something they will do. So if new detections occur out of the infested area, they'll work together to send a crew to those locations, scout, or for potential eradication efforts. So it's a very broad sort of representation of various control options and a timeline for when they're most effective. Step one, don't move the insect. And that's an all year round problem, is when the nymphs or the adults aren't out and moving on their own, there's still the risk of moving egg masses. And again, as egg masses can be on anything, it's a constant issue that requires constant vigilance. So each year we're adding new counties to the quarantine. So previous quarantine was the purple counties, but the blue counties were added in 2021. And so every year new counties are being added, and it's expanding the quarantine range. Why does quarantine matter? Well, it's important because no one can intentionally move viable life stages of this insect without a permit, of course. And regulated items can be so many different things: outdoor items, vehicles, equipment, trailers, recreational vehicles, hard goods, stone and tile, decorative materials, firewood, all nursery stock, not just plants they feed on, but anything, because they might lay eggs on it. So educating the public about this insect is really key, because they can stop the spread by checking when they're moving their vehicle within the quarantine zones or across quarantine zones. If they're driving, traveling, camping, whatever. So this checklist helps residents be able to recognize the various life stages and understand what they can do to not accidentally spread this insect to new locations. But it also affects businesses and organizations. They have to get permits to move vehicles, equipment, and goods within and out of the quarantine zone. So it's another additional complication. Another thing we can do is scrape or smash eggs. If you kill them before they hatch, they can't cause damage to anything, right? And so Penn State developed this. It's a hard sort of card, and it has information on it, both on the front and the back, that can help residents understand how to use it. But here's a bunch of egg masses, some adults, and you can use the card or something like a putty knife to scrape the eggs and then let them fall into some sort of container. And then if you submerge them in rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer, those eggs are never going to hatch. You can also smash them with a hard flat surface, and they're big enough that you can see and tell when the eggs all pop. So that's one way people can do it. But it's limited effectiveness, because on average, most of the egg masses are going to be high up and out of reach. So we can do what we can, but this isn't an effective method to really eradicate the insect. If you find them on your property, you can, get to some of them, but likely not all of them. Tree traps are also effective, especially circle traps. We can use some aspects of their behavior to track them. So adults really just have a strong drive to move up vertical surfaces. They'll do it on trees, they'll do it on light poles or any kind of tall pole. And so they actually tried to develop some pole traps, and I don't know if there's long-term viability with that, but folks are working on it. And if they're flying in groups, they will definitely also orient towards tall vertical structures. And so we can use that to our advantage by creating traps that encircle the entire trunk, but there's room for them to get up underneath this mesh, and then it funnels them into some sort of container. So here's a homemade one. There are commercially available options. And by the way, the background of this, see all that sooty mold? That's what we're talking about with honeydew and sooty mold. You can tell that this location has had a serious long-term infestation. Pesticides are also an option. We're not going to talk a lot about it. They are susceptible to most standard pesticides. It's important to use them at the right time so you don't impact the blooms and the pollinators and such. And there's more information available at the Penn State Extension website. I'll give you more information about that a little bit later. There's also a how-to guide for residents. So these are people who are likely to not know all that much about pesticides. It's something we have to be very careful with making recommendations for residents on using pesticides. The worry is they'll use too much or use it unsafely or, poison themselves or something. So there's detailed information available for people who are interested in learning this. But one important aspect that we can do is you can recognize, treat, or remove tree of heaven. Because tree of heaven is one of their favorite host plants. They spend a lot of time on it. It's very distinctive looking. And so if we can move or treat that plant, that can put a dent in the population. So tree of heaven, see a lot of nymphs here lined up on the compound leaves. If you have tree of heaven on your property, or for other situations, like there was a concerted effort here in Pennsylvania to remove tree of heaven from near train yards, because the worry was that the insects would either hitch a ride on the train cars or lay their eggs on the train cars, both of which have definitely happened. So they started removing Tree of Heaven from these high-risk areas. But for residents on the property, they can remove them. That's a good place to focus some management efforts. So you can remove the trees or you can treat them. So how to identify Tree of Heaven? First thing I ever noticed when I first encountered Tree of Heaven was it has an interesting smell, and I think it smells like stale peanut butter. If you crush the leaf and kind of smell it, you can smell a very distinctive odor to it, which is unique and will help you identify it. It's different from other plants that can look similar, like black walnut or sumac. Tree of Heaven has a smooth leaf margin, but with 1 to 2 knobs at the base of the leaflet. They have really large compound leaves. It says 10 to 40 leaflets, but it's usually a lot more than 10. They have really, really big compound leaves. So very recognizable. So if you're going to treat Tree of Heaven, the pesticide that we know the most about, and I think the paper there is dimethicron. It's active for several weeks, and it's going to kill any of these insects that feed on that tree. Again, it's got to be used safely. Another option would be to remove the tree altogether. That can help reduce a hotspot on the property. But this isn't necessarily completely an elimination of the insect from your property. Likely just move on to other plants, but they might disperse completely away. It's hard to know. They can be very unpredictable. But Tree of Heaven in itself is an invasive species, and it is very hardy. And if you chop it like this and leave just a trunk, it'll sprout a new tree. And so you also have to follow up with application of an herbicide to prevent that. And so again, using the herbicide, gotta use it safely. Okay, some take-home messages on control. We can all work together to help slow the spread by checking belongings before traveling and being careful with quarantine zones and educating other people about the insect. You know, for residents, do what you can to manage it. Stomp and smash and scrape eggs. Don't overreact and go crazy with pesticides, and do so safely. And if you have a major infestation, go to the Penn State Extension website and get help, or Stop SLF website. I'll keep those here in a bit. You may not be able to prevent the insect from moving onto your property, and you might require repeated management efforts to keep populations down. Okay. So let's go over some resources for reporting, identification, and management. So the Penn State Extension website has a lot of information. It's a place you can report sightings. It can help you identify insects, so help you determine if you have a lookalike insect for someone who's not well versed in insect identification, and resources for management. More broadly, and for folks outside of Pennsylvania, stopslf.org is a really great site. It's a collaborative effort between all of these different research groups. There is information on research, published papers, talks that are given, information on management and general resources. It's a really great website also. So at the Penn State Extension website, you can find things like the Spotted Lanternfly management for residents, more information, a fact sheet on Tree of Heaven, so you can learn more about that. And that's all I have. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer your questions. And I also have included an email here in case you have questions and we don't get to them in time.
Okay, thank you, Holly. As usual, interesting information, always good to know a lot of these things. I do have a few questions for you. Okay. Mickey Penrod says, do all levels of the insect do damage, or is it just adults?
They all do damage, but it's variable. So we know the most about Tree of Heaven because that's how we're able to observe them more out in the field, you know, out in forests, edge of forests. And the nymphs can damage the trees all on their own without the adults being present. What we are finding is adults seem to be more damaging, and that's a combination of maybe some of their biological factors. Maybe they have more potent salivary enzymes. Maybe it's a numbers thing. It could also be that the adults are around longer. And so they have more time to be on a particular host and therefore cause damage on it.
Okay. Travis asks, is there any indication that spotted lanternfly will have the ability to vector 1,000 cankers disease in Jigglins in North America?
We right now do not have any strong evidence that they transmit any pathogens. But there's active research going on. There are concerns about pathogens to grapes because they do really like grapes. Jigglins is that black walnut, I think. We don't have any reason to think that they are transmitting anything to black walnut. But there are active studies. We have people working on this, and so far the answer is no, we don't think so. And that's such good news because it's such a damaging insect. If they were also transmitting pathogens, it's just this whole new level of complication.
All right. David Williams wants to know, I've been listening to a lot of webinars on spotted lanternfly, even though they're not here yet in Buffalo, New York. It seems like only the entomologist and university type people are recommending scraping and destroying the eggs. The people in the field dealing with the pest in Eastern Pennsylvania with hundreds of hours of experience will say scraping eggs is a complete waste of time. What are your thoughts?
Sure, I see both sides of that. If you have a small, so if you're a resident and you look out in your yard and you realize you've got eggs on something where you can reach the entirety of the tree or bush, maybe it's a woody bush or something, eradicate the eggs, it doesn't hurt. But on a broader sense, you're right. They tend to aggregate on really big trees. We're short compared to really big trees and we can't reach all of the eggs. So, that diagram I showed you where we can reach like 2% of the eggs, it's true. It's not effective for big scale infestations and broad control, but it is something that residents can do and that empowers them and they like to be able to contribute. When I'm out and about in Eastern Pennsylvania, going out to my field sites, if I stop somewhere, like at a rest stop or someplace, I will see spotted lanternfly smushed all over the sidewalks. People recognize this insect, they want to do their part, and they're quick to smush. So it's something that residents can do, and we encourage that. But you're right that scraping egg masses is not going to have big, broad-scale impacts on their populations.
Thank you. Lindsay says, is there any research available on trunk injections for control in sensitive urban areas?
So pesticides is what I think you're meaning there. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if those studies are ongoing. I don't think there is any data that's published on that. So I really don't have an answer for you on that. Sorry. It's possible that it's ongoing now and it hasn't been published and I don't know.
Okay. Do they lay eggs on the underside of a car or other hard to spot places? And I think you've already answered that in some ways.
I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
it could be tricky. It's worth it. It's worth a check if you have something parked for a long time. If you can get up under it and check it out, you should.
Okay. Let's see. George says, tree of heaven is notoriously hard to control. Not only do trunks resprout, but the root network will set up lots of new shoots. Do the resources provided include detailed instructions for effective control?
Well, you are right. Tree of heaven itself an invasive species. Partly it's invasive because it is very, very hardy. You're exactly right about that. I think the best answer to that is to apply an herbicide so that you can kill the roots and prevent it from being able to resprout. Yeah.
I think I understand that as well. Also, you might want to ask someone who, one of the companies that sell the herbicides and that kind of thing, because sometimes you can add oil or different kinds of things to the herbicide to make it work better as far as killing it. This is from someone who's grown grape grapevines, and those things are hard to kill. So,
They are. They are.
but I would suggest talking to somebody that deals with that as far as some of the things you can add, because that's what I have done. Let's see. Can you give an overview of what is known about spotted lanternfly interactions with predators of insects?
So if there are predators that are effective at catching and eating spotted lanternfly, there are some mantids will do that, and I have seen a few of the really big reduvids out just with their stylets just puncturing an adult spotted lanternfly. It's pretty impressive, but they don't put a dent in the population. It's just occasionally they'll stumble into it. I've seen assassin bug nymphs really go after eggs, but again, they're just a little cluster that might be attacking a tree with egg masses on it, but there might be hundreds or thousands of egg masses, and you've got a collection of like a dozen insects trying to eat them. It just isn't, it doesn't really make a big impact, unfortunately.
Okay. Dustin asked, do you have any information on the relationship to maples? I am responsible for managing some sugar maple plantings and wondered how much they preferred that species compared to, say, red maple or red maple hybrids.
Yeah, they also like sugar maple, I hate to say. They seem to like silver maple less. And we have a limited number of maples here in Pennsylvania. And so I've had people asking questions about maples that are found in other parts of the country, and I don't have experience with them. But we are finding that sugar maple is something they spend time on, and it seems to be adults, and it seems to be late season. So when they're gravid, when they're mating, when they're laying eggs, late season, they'll spend time on maples, especially red and sugar.
Okay. Elizabeth asked, I've seen a lot of mixed information about how concerned fruit growers beyond grapes should be. It seems clear that spotted lanternfly doesn't kill healthy fruit trees, but would you say fruit growers should be concerned about the loss of fruit during a heavy infestation?
I would say yes, but it is going to be species dependent and potentially variety dependent, and we don't know enough. You know, when the insect first was identified and we had an idea that it was here, we started seeing it out in apple orchards, for example. And while they do infest apple orchards, we're finding they don't seem to damage it as much as we worried. And so initially we talked about how we should be worried about apple, but now after a few years, we're less worried. You know, I have this preliminary data for peaches, but I don't really have data for, you know, other types of fruit trees. And there's a lot yet to do and a lot yet to learn. So be worried, be vigilant, learn what you can, pay attention to the new research that comes out. But right now, I can't really give you specific recommendations because we just don't know yet. There's so many possible types of trees that need to be studied to really answer the question effectively.
All right, thank you. Aside from the detection in Kansas, what do you think the likelihood is of spotted lanternfly spreading further west quickly? And then also in conjunction with that, how far west have they been found so far?
Well, dead specimens have been found on the West Coast. So California, Oregon, but dead specimens. I thought about putting this slide in and I didn't, but Temple University, you can find this information at stopslf.org. Temple University is doing modeling work. And so given the wide host range, where those plants are found in the US, given the temperature range that the insect can handle, and it can handle quite cold and quite hot and quite humid and surprisingly sometimes dry climates, they can colonize most of the United States, which is a scary and shocking modeling effort. And whether that plays out or not, I don't know, but potentially, theoretically, they can inhabit a lot of different areas, with, maybe South Florida being excluded and desert regions being excluded, the most other places where there's enough plants for them to feed on. And yeah, they can colonize a pretty broad area of the US.
Oh, that's great. Great news. At
I
least,
know, right?
at least we know. Yes.
Yeah.
Rainbow, David Anderson makes the comment, Rainbow and Dr. Phil Lewis at USDA have done several trials with injections of dinotefuran, and he says highly effective. So that's just, already have the answer there.
Very cool.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Have any biological controls been seen yet?
Yes. There are folks working on biocontrol wasps, and there's work going on at UC Riverside for this, and I think the University of Rhode Island. So there's active work going on in this area. I don't know how viable, these potential biocontrols will be, but there's definitely is being studied. And they also have tried a bacterial control, Bovaria, and so those studies are actively underway but not finalized right now. And the idea was to use this bacteria as an alternative to pesticides. And so there are a lot of different creative ways that are being explored to try and look at control that doesn't just rely on pesticides.
Okay. Is spotted lanternfly toxic to predators? Coloring suggests it might be.
Well, yeah, they've got that pretty cool aposematic coloring, right? And so there's some indication that they can sequester compounds from Tree of Heaven.
Okay, Holly, are you still there?
I am, but there's more that we need to learn about that. We don't really think they're super toxic. Some insects will have aposematic coloration, and it's all for show, right? So there's still more research being done in this area before we really have a definitive answer.
Okay. Do you think scientists could produce some kind of antibiotic like pesticide that could be used to kill the microbiome symbiotes in their gut and effectively starve the insect?
Well, this is an active area of research in a lot of plant-feeding insects. It's been explored in other species, and there's work being done actually in our lab, at the Urban Lab at Penn State, in this area. But so with actual antibiotics, and they're effective. So they kill their microbiome and they weaken the insects. It may not kill them outright, but it will certainly weaken them. It may kill a certain percentage of them. But there are real issues with injecting trees with antibiotics out in the wild, and I'm not sure how effective it will be in long term, but we're certainly looking into it. And so that's another one of the creative ways that we're trying to better understand how we can weaken or kill this insect without using pesticides.
Okay, David Williams comments that one webinar he listened to recently said that imidacloprid injections have had variable results. Dinotefuran as a basal bark spray apparently works the best, or a bifenthrin spray. So
yeah.
Okay, that's the last of the questions. Elizabeth Barnes has put in the chat, and it's a good reminder to everyone, we are actually having a webinar coming up later on control of Tree of Heaven, and you can register on the emeraldashboard.info page. That is the EAB University page on that website. You want to see that, you can register for that. Other than that, great questions, great presentation. I wanted to let you all know again that you will be getting an email tomorrow that will help you, if you want CEUs, will help you get those figured out. And again, Holly, thank you so much. Thanks to our participants, and I hope you all have a great day. I'm going to end the webinar now.